I don't know about you, but I'm excited about this gospel meeting. I hope that you are, and I hope that you'll get to know me enough just this day that you'll feel comfortable about inviting your friends and tell them about the great opportunities that we have here this week to just learn about the Lord and to be in His presence and especially be inside His book. I hope you'll bring your Bibles too. I hope that you will be the kinds of people that enjoy looking into the Bible, or are you that individual who cares this kind of Bible, whichever kind it is? That's great. It's just a joy to be here today, and I look forward to getting to know lots of you folks. When Brother Gary called and said, could you come and hold a meeting? I thought, where's Lexington, and I thought of every state except North Carolina. It's not that this is an unimportant place. It's very important to all of you, and I thought about, well, where on earth is Lexington? And then he talked about Bill Boyd over there at Greensboro, said, we heard of you when you preached over there in that meeting several years ago when Bill Boyd was over at Greensboro, and it's just good to be back up in this area. Judy and I grew up in Alabama. We spent 10 years in the mission field, about 10 years in New Zealand, and did some work in Fiji and Samoa while we were there, and preached 10 years in Birmingham, Alabama, and 35 years in Florida, and it's 4 children, 13 grandchildren, 9 great-grandchildren, and 2 more next month. Guess where we're going to be next month? You can be guessing about that and everything. Let's get inside what this lesson is all about. Messages from heaven is the theme. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Messages from heaven. The entire week is going to be talking about the fact that God has spoken. If you could just preach one sermon in the world, what title would you give it? You got one sermon to preach to everybody on this earth. Somebody asked me that question one time, and I've thought a lot about it. And I think Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, God has spoken in former times, in different ways, divers ways, and divers manners, hath in these last days spoken unto us by His Son. And that's the focus where God has spoken. If God hasn't spoken, we're all right. We wouldn't have a clue what to do anyway. You just go out and eat, drink, and be merry, because there's no way you'd ever know what was right and what was wrong. So why would you not set your own standard of what's right and what's wrong and have that kind of an attitude in relationship? But God has spoken. And so what I want us to do today is to look at 2 or 3 places where God has spoken. And throughout this week, the whole thing will be messages from heaven. I want us today to look at the Sermon on the Mount. I want us to look because God has spoken from the mountain. God spoke from the mountain. Seeing the multitudes, you know the Beatitudes. He went up into a mountain, and when He was set, His disciples came to them, and He opened His mouth saying, blessed. And how many of those Beatitudes could you come up with? I think it's remarkable as you look at those first 12 verses in Matthew chapter 5, everything that's in Matthew chapter 5, and in the Beatitudes, that's the word that means blessed. Blessed is this individual. The Latin word is beatus or something. I barely can speak English. I better stay away from Latin and all that other stuff. I had Greek in college, but just learned enough Greek to be dangerous, if that makes sense. Sometimes folks who talk a lot about Greek aren't really that smart. But anyway, I'm smart enough not to do it. Anyway, here you have the Beatitudes. And everything in the Beatitudes is counter to the world in which you and I live. It was really counter to what was happening in that first century. He's beginning His work, Matthew chapter 4, verse 17. He comes into Galilee, and there He's preaching the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then there's that quotation in the couple of verses after that talked about He would be preaching in Galilee. And so that's what He did. And seeing the multitude, He goes up to this mountain, and this crowd comes with Him, and He opens His mouth, and He says things that are counterculture. Poverty of spirit, humility. Are you that individual who said, I am really humbled and I'm proud of it? You understand that concept? I'm a humble individual. And everything that's there, a little bit later, blessed are the meek. Meek people are seen as being weak. In fact, we often define the word meekness by henpecked husband. You understand what I'm talking about? That's not what meekness is. That husband who just does everything his wife tells him to do, he's not meek. He's henpecked. And the Bible calls Moses the meekest man on earth. Moses who went in front of Pharaoh, and Moses who stood who stood before Israel and gave them commandments of God, and even argued with God whenever he said, God, if you're going to destroy this nation, destroy me with it. That's not humility. No, that's meekness. A person is meek because they're greater than somebody else and chooses to become their servant. Jesus washing the feet, that's meekness right there. And we need to understand. And so he talks about having poverty of spirit. Think of a high-spirited horse. Well, we know people like that. They are proud and they're so self-centered about themselves and everything. And everything Jesus starts to say runs counter to that hungering and verse 6, Matthew 5, verse 6, hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Come on, you got to be joking. Who's doing that anymore? Especially in this day and age in which we're entertained by sin. Romans chapter 1 has that whole list of sins. And when we get to the last verse of Romans chapter 1, it says, not only do they do such things, and this is a paraphrase, but they enjoy watching people to do it. Watching people do it. They take pleasure in those who do it. Think of the entertainment industry. What's television all about? What's movies all about? What's the media? What's it all about? It's entertaining with the magnification of sin. And yet Jesus talks about blessed are the pure in heart. That's as counterculture as anything could ever be. And so Jesus says, and then he says to the disciples, this had to get their attention, and he said, blessed are you when men persecute you and revile you and say all manner of evil against you falsely. We quote that verse sometimes, all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And we probably don't really know what persecution is. Persecution may be where somebody says, well, don't ever talk to me about the Bible. Persecution in biblical times was Paul coming into the houses and binding these Christians and taking them out and putting them to death. And that's part of what Jesus had in mind when he said they'll revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely. You want to see Jesus and you want to see the impact that he had? You get beyond verse 12 and you're the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth. There's the affirmation in verse 17 and 18 of the ever-abiding nature of the law of God. I haven't come to destroy the law and the prophets. Every jot and tittle has survived. Moses writing the Old Testament, the jot is the smallest Hebrew letter, the tittle just a little mark, like an accent mark. And so every jot and tittle that Moses wrote down in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, every one of them is still there. And so Jesus affirms that, and then all of a sudden he turns around, and in the rest of chapter 5 he said, ye have heard that it hath been said. We don't have time to look at every one of those, but I want you to just look how many times he says, you have heard that it has been said, but it has been said. And so he says, it has been said, thou shalt not kill. But I say unto you, don't call your brother a fool, or you'll be in danger of hell fire. Man, that really runs different from murder, doesn't it? I mean, you see the difference? You've heard that it hath been said, thou shalt not commit adultery. And he says, but I say unto you, don't have a lustful heart, because that is adultery in the heart. And then he talked about something that they had worked out. By the way, the Bible never said, hate your enemies. That's their interpretation that they'd put in the Bible. The Bible did say, love your neighbors yourself, but it never said hate your enemies. That runs counter to the very nature of God. God doesn't hate his enemies, hates what they do. But whenever he says, but I say unto you, love your enemies. Is that verse 44? Love your enemies and bless them that curse you and pray for them that despitefully use you. Everything he says there is counterculture. Isn't that amazing? When you get to the end of that, look at the last verses of chapter 7, verse 28 and 29. When he finished this Sermon on the Mount, guess what happened? They were astonished at his doctrine. They were astonished at the teaching he was doing, because he taught them like somebody had authority. Hey, that's a new word almost in this modern day and age, isn't it? What's happened to authority in the public school system? Those of you who are teachers know a part of what I'm talking about. My my oldest child, a daughter, teaches public school in Jackson, Tennessee. And a little third grader the other week, she asked him some question, something about the lesson. And he said, I take the fifth. Well, Is that, what a comment that is on what's happening in this world, you know. And it wasn't asking anything personal about his life at all. It was a math question or a geography question or something like that. And now I take the fifth on that, you know. I'm not going to answer it. Young people, don't you dare do that. Your mom and dad, they'll whoop you, okay? I want you to understand that. And but isn't that remarkable? I'll take the fifth on that. No, you cannot. But Jesus taught them one who had authority, and not like the scribes and the Pharisees. You know what the scribes and Pharisees had done? Much of what's happened in our religious world, in the use of the word Christian in the widest way, and I hesitate to even use that word Christian because everything on this earth can be Christian. 4 miles from where I preach, there's a homosexual church. You know, and they say they worship the Lord Jesus. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of worshiping going on there in relationship to that. Isn't that a commentary on our day and everything? But the scribes and Pharisees would read the law, and then they would come up and make some rule about it. The Sabbath day's journey. You don't read about that in the Old Testament. They had decided that you couldn't walk a great distance, and the Jewish rabbis, these scribes and Pharisees, had decided you could take 2,000 steps on the Sabbath day. And if you took 2,001, you were in trouble. They were conservative like that. Remember, Paul said, of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one, 39 stripes. Why? Because we're going to keep the law unless we miscount. We're going to beat you only 39 times. That's an apostle of Jesus Christ you're beating up. There's not a whole lot of difference in the torment in hell whether you do it 40 times or 39 times. You understand? But they made all of these rules about a Sabbath. You know, the rabbis had even discussed whether you could eat a chicken that had hatched on the Sabbath day or whether you could eat an egg that had been laid on the Sabbath day. They'd had all their theological discussions about this, and sometimes that's the kind of thing that happens in seminaries where preachers go off and get trained to come out. They can dot every I and cross every T and tell you everything on earth that's right and wrong. No, that's not the way this thing works. And so, by the way, they decided that little chicken that had picked its way out of that shell was working on the Sabbath day. And so they would literally mark that chicken. And I don't know if you'd have to watch every chicken that was hatched. And then you'd have to spray paint it. I'm not sure how they did it. I'd just go down to Walmart or not Walmart, well, I guess I'd get it at Walmart, spray paint, get some spray paint, and just paint that thing pink or purple or something like that. Then I'll never eat this chicken. It's an unholy chicken because it worked on the Sabbath day. He taught them as one who had authority. But I say to you, and see, that's the key. That's what church is all about, isn't it? It's not to get to learning from the rabbis and the scholars of our day and go off and figure out all of this matter one way or the other. You know how often that changes? I'm talking about ideas about what's right and what's wrong. One of the major denominations, about 1912 or 13, right in that period of time, and one of the mainstream denominations went from the teaching that a child is born a sinner, and he is a sinner, and if he dies, he'll go to hell, and therefore we've got to sprinkle him. Of course, that idea came out of Catholicism, but when Protestant Reformation came along, they brought that over into the dogma. And so for 200 years, that mainstream denomination had said, when a child is born, he's lost. He's got sin in his life. And so you got to baptize him. Well, the scribes and the Pharisees, put that in quotation marks, came together. And so their manual, the confession of their faith that came out afterwards said, starting in 1913, I believe it was, said that children born in 1913 and afterwards would not be sinners. They would be recognized as being innocent before God. And there was one man who facetiously said, well, I was born, in December of 12. I don't know if I'm a sinner or not. Isn't that amazing? Scribes and Pharisees that's not Jesus. Who cannot understand what Jesus meant whenever he says, if you're angry with your brother, don't say raka. Who could not understand the words of Jesus. Whoever looks on a woman to lust after her in his heart has already committed adultery in his heart. Who cannot understand that? Who cannot understand? Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Pray for them that despitefully use you. Got to get to chapter 6, though. Chapter 6, he prayed differently. He prayed differently. In fact, he prayed so differently that in Luke's account of what we call the Lord's Prayer, these disciples heard Jesus praying, and when Jesus stopped praying, they came and said, Jesus, teach us how to pray. You want to put that in the context? We're talking about devout men who became devout leaders in the church, the apostles in the church. They were devout Jews, and they'd been praying all of their life, and they heard Jesus pray, and when they heard Jesus pray, they said, we don't know how to pray. Lord, teach us how to pray. And the very first two words of what we call the Lord's Prayer totally changes the nature of prayer. You don't read our Father in prayers in the Old Testament. Isn't that remarkable? Our Father, which art in heaven. And that whole prayer is so different from the kinds of the prayers of Judaism. And you think sometimes in the religious world of the roteness of the prayers of memorized prayer. Some services, every prayer is just like every other kind of prayer. Paul says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything with prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known unto God. If it's worth being concerned about, it's worth praying about. That's why it says, in everything with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And so he talked about food. He talked about food. Give us this day our daily bread. We've arrived at a time, if you're one of those people who offer thanks in a restaurant, people think you're a bit weird. Now, I know the Carolinas is quite different from South Florida. I understand that. But it's a rarity down in South Florida. It is so rare in South Florida that if I'm in a restaurant and see a family that offers thanks, I go over before I leave that restaurant. I want to thank you for what you did and what you're teaching your children. Heard about the country boy that came into the city? And he ordered in a restaurant, and he bowed his head and thanked God for the food that give us this day our daily bread. And God had done it, so he was saying thank you to God. And these city slickers, these intellectuals, the puffed up kind of individuals came over here and said, boy, everybody do that where you come from? And he said, yeah, everybody except the hogs. Let that one soak in. Give us this day our daily bread. And then, God, forgive me like I forgive others. You having trouble with somebody's done you wrong, you're having trouble dealing with your attitude toward them, put their name in that prayer. God, forgive me like I forgive, and you put somebody's name there. God, you be as merciful to me as I am, and you put your enemies there. You'll do one of two things. You'll forgive him, or you'll quit praying. And so that's the nature of that prayer. And then he talked about those individuals who prayed on the street corners. Some of this is Matthew chapter 23, thinking they'd be heard for their much speaking. Those Pharisees were not dummies. You know why they stood on the street corner? If you stand in the middle of the block, they can only see you north and south. They're smart enough, if you get down the corner, it's north and south and east and west, and they're accomplishing the very thing that and Jesus says, you enter into your closet to pray. Enter into your closet to pray. We talked about in that prayer, he says, forgive me like I forgive others. And that's why you get to chapter 7, verse 1, that talks about hypercritical judgment. And said, if you hypercritically judge others, that's the very standard God is going to use to judge you. I know the Bible says, judge not that you be not judged. That's Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. But in chapter 7, verse 15, chapter 7, verse 15, he said, by their fruits you shall know them. You know, it's all right to look at the fruits and make judgments about their fruits. Brother Keeble, you know the name Marshall Keeble? Brother Keeble said, God didn't make me a judge, but he made me a fruit inspector. And Jesus said, John 7:46, judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgments. That's a command. And so the kind of judging that is in Matthew chapter 7, read verse 2 and 3, where you've got just a little splinter in your eye and your brother's got a log in his eye. And let's flip that around. Your brother's got the splinter and you've got the log, and you go over there and you've got the beam. I think that's the word Jesus uses. Can you imagine having a 2x4 in your eye, and the guy's got a splinter in his eye, and you're trying to get over there with an 8-foot 2x4 and say, hey, let me get that little speck out of your life? Won't work. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. And you're talking about one who spake with authority. Look in chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, when he says, there's two ways to go. One's a broad way, it's the easy way. It's a very comfortable kind of lifestyle, and many are going down that road. But there's a narrow gate, there's a difficult way, and few there are who find it. I remember as a younger preacher, I thought I was a lot smarter than I started preaching when I was 15, by the way. In fact, I've preached every Sunday of my life since I was 15 years of age. I know there are some exceptions of that, but I love preaching. You know, oh, okay, I'm 78, and yes, this is my hair. I'll just throw that out there just so we won't be discussing it all week. And so, as a younger preacher, I would say, how many is few? Well, the Bible tells that. The ark wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved. You put those two verses together, and it's just me and my family. I don't believe there's room for anybody else to go. You know, we're the 8. You understand what I mean? That's a misuse of that's a 12, 13-year-old kid trying to look smart. But I do know this: there are more people going to hell than to heaven. That's counterculture in America. In fact, sometimes there are members of the church that are struggling whether there's an eternal hell. The Bible describes an eternal hell, Revelation chapter 14, as the smoke of their torment ascends up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night. That's what hell's like. And some people say, oh, God is so loving, God just couldn't do that. Well, who are we to tell God what God's going to do? Romans chapter 9, verse 20 says, shall the piece of pottery say to him that made it, why'd you make me this way? You know, God's the potter, and we're just a hunk of mud. And he says, what right do we have to say to God? Ours is not to judge God, it's to understand God. And when God says, I'm going to give you free choice, and most individuals are going to choose to do wrong. Now I want to back up a little bit to Matthew chapter 6 and talk to you about some things in Matthew chapter 6. We've looked at 5 where we've talked about the Lord says you have heard that it hath been said. We've looked at 7, looking at those judgments, at the broad way and the narrow way. Jesus talks about that. The last verses of chapter 7, the wise man built his house on the rock. I bet you've sung that one a few times. If you're a Sunday school teacher, you've sung it so much that you can even pitch it just perfectly right every time. I've never heard anybody pitch that song wrong, by the way, you know. Anyway, you've got, we know that. We got to get the lesson. Both the wise men and the foolish men knew how to build a house. Sometimes we think, well, he's talking about those who know what's right and those who do not know what's right. No, here are two individuals who know exactly what's right. One of them does what is right, the other one does not. And that's the close of the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he taught them as one having authority. How much authority does he have? The last verses of Matthew 28, verse 18, all authority in heaven and in earth has been given unto me. That is remarkable. But I want us to look at chapter 6, the latter part of chapter 6, and spend the rest of the time looking at Matthew chapter 6. Because there you get into that whole section about worrying. And it's a great lesson about how much God cares for us. Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, you actually could start in verse 24, where he talks about the fact that there's a danger of us trusting in mammon, riches, and you cannot live a life where your security is looked on by the amount of money you have in the bank or things of that nature. He says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That's a part of the Sermon on the Mount also. I think it's also a part of chapter 6. But he says, and I've got the New King James, therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life. Hello? If I can't worry about my life, what am I going to worry about? That's the whole point. He said, which of you by taking thought can change your height? I loved to play basketball when I was a kid. I just missed it by 1 foot 8 inches of being a real superstar. I've got a friend he's 6 foot 8, and I said, Jim, he preaches Jim Shadwick, you may have known of Jim. I said, Jim, how tall are you? He said, I'm not that tall. I'm 5 foot 20. And I said, well, you're not that much bigger than me. I'm 4 foot 20. And so, I've got a big brother. Could always beat me in basketball. He was 3.5 years older than me. It's not fair to have a brother that is more athletic than you are, and you're trying to play basketball against him. Just won't work. Go ahead and worry about it. Toss and turn every night and worry about things that you do not control. And he says, guess what? And then he says, which of you, can do that? You simply cannot change any of the things. And then he says, here's what I want you to do. Look at the birds. How can I not worry? Jesus, I got a lot of problems in my life. I'm getting old, and I've got aches in my body. Some of you may be like that lady says she has, three people in her life that just aggravated. Who's that? Ben and Arthur, and who's that other one? I can't think of the other one, but it's Ben Gay and arthritis and Charlie Horse. Okay, and so thank God for the fact that He'll take care of us. And He says, here's the way you deal with it. Take time, look at the birds. Isn't that remarkable? As simple a thing. Well, what do birds do? Well, what do they not do? Well, I'm glad God made squirrels that hide up the nuts, for the winter months. I thank God for squirrels. But Jesus says, look at the birds. They sow not, neither do they reap. And yet your Father feeds them. In 2 other places, Jesus talks about this very same thing. And He says about the birds that not one but one bird falls to the earth without his Father. How many birds are there? Thank God for Google, but Google doesn't know the answer to this. There are 7 billion people on this earth. Google says there's somewhere, here's a real accurate number, there's somewhere between 400 billion and 800 billion birds on this earth. That's a lot of birds. Not one bird falls to the earth without his Father. Did you ever, as a child, find a bird that's fallen out of its nest and you couldn't find the nest? Did you bring it in and say, Mama, look what I found? And you couldn't find a nest? No, Mother, I looked all over the place. And I just couldn't find it. Get a shoebox. Fluffy stuff in there, some little cotton or something like that, pieces of cloth, and try to keep that little bird alive. And you go get the World Book Encyclopedia. Man, you can find everything in World Book. That's sort of like Google. Deceptive is a whole lot better. And so you go and get the World Book Encyclopedia and read everything you can. This may be a new word, birdology. I think it probably is. But and so you read everything you can about birds, and you find out what they eat. And you say, I've got to get some worms. And then you keep reading. And you read about that mother bird chewing up that worm and spitting that worm back in that little bird's mouth. You say, let that sucker die. I'm sorry, I'm just... That's not the way God feels about it. Not one bird falls to the earth without your Father. Let me mention the Greek. My dad says, Dan, don't mention it too much. You'll convince folks that cannot go to heaven. Greek was my minor field of study. I try not to talk about it too much. But that word, falls to the earth, can mean to alight, to land. Not that it's flying alone and it dies, but it falls to the earth. That's sort of the way somebody shoots it with a BB gun, whatever that is, an AK-47, and somebody takes that bird out. No, it cannot even land on this earth. If that's the force of that Greek word, that bird cannot fly from one branch to another. Look at the birds. And then it's in, I think it's 10:25. Matthew 10:25 says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing?" 2 sparrows falls for a farthing. And then he says, "Are you not worth more than those?" We spent those nearly 10 years in the South Pacific, and I found out what a farthing was. New Zealand's got a big copper coin that used to be the old currency that was that big around, called a penny. Big old copper coin. There was another coin half that size called a halfpenny. They called it a halfpenny. You take a halfpenny and you divide a halfpenny in half, it's a mite. And take a mite and divide it in half, that's a farthing. Is that 1/8 of a penny? Or was that one quarter of a penny? 1/2 and half of that and half of that? I don't know. But 2 sparrows are sold for a farthing. Here's a bird that's worth 1/8 of a penny. And your Father feeds them. Are you not worth more than they? Listen, I want to tell you something that I don't believe you've ever seen one time in your life. You've never seen a skinny bird. Are you not worth more to God? And yet they sow not, neither do they reap, and yet your Father feeds them. I don't know how He does it. How would you like to be in charge, feeding all the birds? He is. And He's that much concerned about you. He takes care of evil men. He lets the sun rise on the just and on the unjust, and sends the rain on the good and the bad. That's remarkable. That's back in Matthew chapter 5. It's part of that message from heaven, message from that mountain, isn't it? Well, I don't want to close. By that clock, I've got 4 minutes left, and I'm not going to make this thing fit in 4 minutes. So fasten your seatbelts. I want to talk to you in the closing moments about the special providence that you have as a child of God. Physical blessing, sun and rain on the just and the unjust. Here's a verse. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayers. Put your name in that verse. The eyes of the Lord are over Gary. And his ears are open to Gary's prayer. God hears every prayer. He's aware of every prayer that's prayed on this earth. But that word "hear," ears open to their prayers, is more different from God, who knows everything that's happening on this earth. His ears are open to their prayers. Can I talk about special providence? You ever see 4 or 5 mothers together, got their babies in another room, maybe out playing outside the yard? You have done this in the last week or so, kids playing outside. And all of a sudden, that little baby in the other room with that child outside starts crying, and there's one mother who jumps up and runs out and said, that's my little boy, Bobby. Well, everyone went in there, heard all those crying. No, but that's Bobby's cry. And she runs to Bobby. That's special providence. I know heaven's not this way. I've got a kindergarten brain, and I apologize for it. It's about as big as I can get a hold of it is. Here's heaven. And all of a sudden, here's all this weather report coming into heaven, and here's the reports coming in, and here's this war, and here's this political problem, and here's this fussing, and here's all of this going on. And I know it's not this way. God's sitting on the throne, and everybody just coming in, giving God all this information, got to process every bit of this, God. And all of a sudden, the God of heaven said, stop. My son Gary is crying. This verse in Psalms, I've got the chapter 64, I think it is, that says, God takes your tears and puts them in a bottle. My guess is there are several widows here. You know what loneliness is. You know what it's like to no longer have a husband. The kids moved away and they never called anymore. You're lying awake in the middle of the night and tears flowing down your cheek. You've got a tissue there. Use the bed sheet. Guess what God does? The tears are put in God's bottle. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous. And if there's anything you and I need to learn and think about as we look at the birds, by the way, I've seen very few skinny Christians. I've seen a lot of fat ones, by the way, just in passing. Thought I'd throw that one out. But you stop and think about it. If he's concerned about a bird, 800 billion birds, how much more is he concerned about you? And you're crying in the middle of the night. You're crying in the middle of the night. And figuratively, God collects that tear because it's precious to him. You did that to your child, just a few weeks, few months old, and the child is crying, and you've tenderly taken your hands and pushed those tears away. Folks, that's the kind of God you and I serve. That's the kind you and I serve. God sees everything. You ever go to a piano recital where your children are doing a performance? Kindergarten graduation, you know what I'm talking about? Here's the stage, and everybody's lined up on the stage, and all the little children are walking up the wall and everything. And there is your granddaughter, a little blonde-headed, blue-eyed kid right over there. And that little boy's